I'm Alfonso Winker.
And I'm Trina Olson. And together, we're the co-founders of Team Dynamics.
And this is Behave. Trina, something we've talked a little bit about, but not a bunch lately, is our book.
Yeah, it keeps being in our lives, that's for sure, but it's not out in the wild yet.
Yeah, so later this year, our book, Hiring Revolution, A Guide to Disrupt Racism and Sexism, is going to be available for all the world to read and wrestle with. And something that producer Levi really encouraged us to reflect on is the idea that we are making a fixed object inside of a constantly changing context. And inside of that, we keep being two people who are co-creating, who are of different genders from one another and different races. And so I thought we could talk about how we're making this offering of a book co-creating race and gender while the world is really in flux.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating, and especially for our listeners who are doing projects together. And so today we'll talk about the book because that's the shared project you and I have. But I think about the relevance of the layers of what you were just discussing, which is we're all trying to make an impact, right, with the work that we're doing. And context always matters, but a whole lot of us have been fed this belief that we can create something so specifically that it'll just be relevant forever, all the time. And I think it's not even the right framework because we're really convinced that some of the things that can help get in the way of the perennial impact of racism and sexism in hiring are just going to be true for a lot of years because there's a lot of stuff to undo. So it's just going to stay relevant. But also how we start to build up the agility and the adaptability, and how as the world changes around us, because I'm in a white woman body and you're in a POC man body, we're also experiencing our experiences different. So whether we're thinking the ebbs and flows of the world around us, the constellation of our families, the context of our organization, it can be really easy to lull ourselves into accidentally thinking because something is happening nationwide or globally or even in our neighborhood that we're probably having the same experience. So it's interesting to be colleagues who have shared goals and are living in the real and alive world trying to get closer to those shared goals.
Yeah, and I love what you're lifting up about the fact that we might be experiencing the same moments or time or event and having a really different experience of it. So I think what might be really interesting is to talk about through the lens of our race, each of us, and of our gender, how we've wrestled with different moments of creating this book while there were moments in life.
Yeah, I'm laughing because a lot of our book creation got loud and a lot of our book creation involved struggle because we were doing a hard thing together. In fact, it was so hard. We knew that it would be better if we did it together. So that idea that I couldn't do this alone and it'd be the same, and you couldn't do it alone and it'd be the same. So we knew the whole time that there was added value in working together, but it also made it emotionally harder because we were struggling with our own experience of something being difficult, and then also navigating how each other was having that experience as well.
Right. I think I probably use the word excruciating about the writing process more than I have about any particular project or creative endeavor I've ever engaged in. And so I'm thinking about all of this was happening inside of COVID, right? And so one of the things we were navigating was how you and I could ever be near each other and work on the book together. So we really tried on Zoom, we really tried on the phone, we really tried to write alone and send stuff back and forth. And at a certain point, we just felt like the way we do our best creative work, part of why we were drawn to working together was the energy of being in a room. So I think about one of the ways that we had to navigate COVID was really strategically think about, okay, I'm not going to see anybody or go anywhere for a chunk of time, and you're not going to see anybody or go anywhere for a huge chunk of time, and we're going to get tested, and then we went and we hunkered down at my cabin for a while,
Yeah.
and we cranked out a bunch of stuff. And so I was thinking about being a man who's a business owner and just like having access to that option,
Mm-hmm.
right? That wasn't something that was available to everybody. Like I really got to make a lot of choices about how I was spending my time so that I could be away to be near you to work on this creative project. So that was one of the early, I think, experiences that I had in the last year of realizing that even in the midst of a pandemic, I could take calculated risk because of my age and my gender and my access to resources.
Yeah, I think often when we talk to folks about the predictability of how our identity influences our moments inside and beyond crisis, right? We've said before, our health, financial well being, employment status makes a really big difference in how we can, if ever, weather some really big storms. And when we even talk about being healthy leading into a pandemic, right? I think about you being a man who's had director level jobs, who's had access to health insurance for a long time, and you've chosen to engage in your own preventative care, right? It didn't come at zero cost.
Right, right.
But when we talk about, right, what it's like for seasonal workers, when we talk about what it's like for hourly workers, when we talk about what it's like for undocumented people, that there's actually this cascade of a health impact and a cascade of a financial impact that buoys us in times of crisis. It doesn't guarantee that we're going to get through anything, right? But it absolutely stacks the deck in our favor. And so I think that's interesting, as I think a little bit just about how I know you pay attention to your health and well-being, but also what it was like for you from a mental health perspective to be in Minneapolis immediately following the murder of George Floyd, right? You and I both live less than 10 miles from where George Floyd was killed. And when I think about the connective tissue of you being the highest ranking man at our company, and therefore a person that a lot of our clients naturally want to talk to, because you really feel and sound in charge to a lot of people, whether you want to or not, right? And you never tell anybody that I'm not in charge. And I never tell anybody that I'm not in charge, right? But there's you, and I recognize there's a gravitational pull towards you. So I think about the pressure that you were under as a high ranking man at our company. And then I think about the emotional toll that the murder of George Floyd and then the following uprisings happened. And that all was happening while we were in a really crucial stage of our book. Do we want to share a little bit about what it was like to navigate and negotiate sharing, but also taking turns on the book during the different parts of the different crises we've been faced with?
Yeah. So what was interesting, not even interesting, what is almost predictable about the way that sort of like capitalism and productivity send these messages was we had a very important deadline in June, I think.
Yep.
And our community, our geographic home, was in the midst of unrest. And it was affecting me emotionally. I was doing some work with some colleagues, sort of unrelated to team dynamics, that was around kind of financial and resource support of a couple of organizer friends. I was sort of being the person who was making sense of some of the issues for a few people in my life. And I kept not being able to like be creative about the book, but I was like, oh, but the timeline and the deadline and the timeline and the deadline. And it was sort of getting mad at the book.
Mm.
And then I remember, and I was grateful for this, we have a practice where this felt really comfortable. And I said, like, I just don't know what's wrong with me. Like, I know how to write and I'm very creative and I have all these opinions. And then you just said, and maybe you're a person of color who's awake and alive in Minneapolis right now. And it was an invitation to remember that I am my whole experience. And that even though there was a book deadline and a company to run and friends in a community to pay attention to, that like it was getting in, right? Like months of quarantine, distance from my family, an uprising in my community, but also I think watching my white friends show up in a new way and feeling like I had to have an opinion about that
Mm.
or being asked to have an opinion about that, there was just output that I wasn't addressing. And so I think part of what the benefit of being on this kind of mixed race, mixed gender duo that we have is that you could invite me into some self-awareness to say, like, stuff's getting in and you're being impacted, and like, take a breather. Should we move the deadline? Like, remembering the things that are in our control and that we are not valued just on that sort of churn or output.
Yeah, one of the values we have, and our colleague Alfred invited us to articulate, is possibility. And it's sort of in moments like that that we have to remember almost nothing is impossible. So for us, right, the idea of calling, our publishing partner and being like, yeah, we gotta move this particular deadline. And I understand that's going to move back the whole project. And no, we can't totally predict when we're going to sort of be back online or ready. And we didn't have to apologize for it, but we had to say, okay, so we actually are feeling so drawn towards how we can be useful about a conversation of racism in American workplaces through hiring and equity, that we really do still want this project to move forward. And we're human beings having a human experience, not outside of the system, which we're pushing against. So to be able to say, okay, this was not what we planned. This was not the timetable we planned. This was not the order of operations. We're usually able to summon it. And you know what? We don't have it right now. And to also say, where is it not okay for me to grab parts and keep going if I happen to have some stamina or energy? And where is it, right? And how do we want to share it? And I think a conversation you were always really good at having with me is your knowing. And I know you have a mom, you have a sister, you have cousins, you've been around a lot of women your whole life, but you've chosen to pay attention to the pattern of lived experience of a lot of group work being put on women to finish or fix or take notes around, and just the idea of being treated as like the proverbial secretary on a team. And we kept and continue to check in and say, okay, is it feeling like I just dumped something on you? And did I? Not just, are you feeling like it? Like, did I? When we started to build up our cadence and our protocols for how we were going to edit, we know we have two different voices. We're two different people.
Right.
We have a voice as a company, and we've developed sort of our author voice together, but we also wanted to make sure that we weren't just nitpicking each other's style or way of speaking. So it wasn't just, let's make sure the book sounds more authoritative and AKA more masculine. You don't sound like that, but that's the voice I make.
You told me I was a baritone once, so.
Well, you are. And then I think, right, my whiteness has been really front and center for me the entire time authoring this book. And again, there's part of me that feels really grounded and ready to go out and tell the world the tips and tricks of how I have been able to successfully be part of mixed teams for the last 25 years in the workplace, right? Because that's just my truth. But there's huge vulnerability in telling that story, given that white people, white women in particular, are voting funny ways, are behaving funny ways, are just not able to listen long enough without being defensive, right? And I'm not outside of that. So I think there's part of me that started to feel timid in a new way as a white author or as your writing partner. And then there was part of me that absolutely felt this newly charged responsibility to make sure that as an author in our book, I'm talking directly to some white people who may need to hear from another white person. So I think in that way, I felt sort of a new command and also then a lot of pressure, because in our team, I'm the white author. And so I think it's been fascinating to just continue to not wonder if our race and our gender is relevant in our writing and our partnership. It's just, and how is it today or this hour, or how is it relevant in this paragraph or this section?
So I'm picking up on something that I want to get into explicitly. So like, let's talk about white women.
Let's do it.
I think what is true in our experience is we interact with a lot of the people who are our point people for clients. A lot of the HR and operations people we interface with are white women. And when I think about the last year, there are some ways that the intersection of whiteness and being a woman, or whiteness and sort of femininity, have intersected. You flagged, and I don't want to miss it. We continue to wrestle with some data about how white women, in particular suburban white women, don't vote in the interest of women and women's health. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away, and we all really had a lot of wondering and fear around reproductive justice, human rights, equal pay. Data started to come out about the ways in which already existing workplace disparities were being exacerbated around women doing emotional work and women working overtime in order to care for their team and care for families. And lots of white leaders were asking you to bless their Black Lives Matter statements over the summer.
Yeah.
So that was also sort of getting picked at throughout the year while we're trying to create this thing that is an offering and a suggestion and some tools for how to upend racist and sexist practices. And then there was this sort of barrage of instances. So I'm curious how that was informing, well, I know how, but can you share how that was informing how you're trying to create this piece we can change the book if we want to, but it's gonna come out, and all of this stuff was happening and in our awareness while we were writing.
Yeah, there's a couple layers for me, and if I miss something I've told you, flag it for me and we'll get to it. So folks who know me know that I'm a visual learner, and the way I keep thinking about this is like disentangling. It's like disentangling yarn when you're trying to crochet. It's like disentangling a necklace that's been in your suitcase. It's just like, yeah, okay, this got all knotted up. And I think the sort of like tension points in that knot for me were, boy, I get frustrated that a lot of organizations, without thinking it through, have bought into an assumption that is not backed by science and it is not correct, that women just should be naturally better at the people management part of workplaces. So the tending to, the care and feeding of, the benefits, right? Just women as natural caretakers. I am not saying women cannot caretake, but it's just untrue that men can't. So, yeah. So part of me starts from there. And then there is this part about how oftentimes we think that women are less likely to behave in sexist ways, when in fact, the same sexism has gotten poured into our bodies as anybody else's. So that internalized sense, and I for sure, I do not speak on behalf of anybody. I'm not the queen of white women, but we have research about groups. And then also I have my lived experience that correlates to that research, which is from girls to women to leadership. I have had the lived experience that I can get farther ahead if I exhibit more masculine attributed behaviors, right? So you hear how I use my voice, right? It's decisions I make about what I'm going to wear. It's about how to be listened to or what leadership looks like. It's about what I get praised for and what I get punished for, about what is coded as professional or strong and what isn't, right? And so I think way too often we're conflating people's identity with some sort of random natural talent or desire they might have, right? And so as we've been writing this book, it's as though we need to remind folks that there is this gap the size you could drive a truck through between what American workplaces say they care about and value and how they go about rank ordering human beings before they hire them, right? The pervasive and predictive nature of these enormous pay gaps, of the enormous predictability of people of color's resumes being skipped over, of women's named resumes being skipped over, right? And I was just talking to a client the other day The preservation of white people's comfort is not a good goal. The goal of our work or our book isn't to just make white people feel bad, right? That's not the point either. The point is saying the problem is so fucking massive that we can't pretend we can do this in little drips and drabs, right? We're not moving fast enough, deep enough, hard enough. And so I think women in the workplace are evaluated based on how comfortable they keep other people, and that women are a problem if we make other people uncomfortable with our tone, with our suggestion, with our decisions, with our priorities, right? And so it's like really been a mindfuck to try to say, okay, what about the connection of whiteness and cisgendered womanness has led to all these misconceptions, have allowed these patterns to just be in front of God and everybody unchecked, right? And so I think that's just some of what I'm thinking about as I'm sort of just disentangling. It's like, okay, the whiteness and the white preference is there, and the desire for white comfort and access to white money is there. Okay, and then women are supposed to be extra nice and extra welcoming. And it's how we get away with like bullshit conversations around fairness, because we say, oh, we just happened to pick the right person. I was nice to everybody. So we also end up using this affect as an excuse. And it's like, we're smarter than that. We're better than that. But we have a lot of re-education and unraveling to do. Yeah.
So thank you for moving us through that. And I think what it reinforced for me is really what I think is a version of our answer of, what do we do when we're making this fixed object in the midst of change is if the last year taught us anything, and to be clear, I am not doing any kind of weird silver lining moment.
Totally.
It's a rough fucking year.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is all of our lessons of the last year, I think, really like fortified us. It reinforced some knowing and belief we already had. And then there was this opening, this waking up that injustice was on high volume this year. And there were folks who were ready to tune in a bigger way, a new way, a larger way, a more expansive way. And so for any of us that are creating or making or offering in pursuit of racial justice, gender liberation, it can be easy to feel like this year was new. And for me, and I think for us, it was, this year was on high volume. And we were just given more and constant and regular information and stories and lived experience right in our faces that we need to keep making our offers. And so that's what it felt like for me is feeling compelled to, not by the deadline or the production of the physical book, but saying, yeah, that dynamic that you talked about where our hiring processes in the US American workplace are obsessed with the comfort of whiteness and the comfort of masculinity. We've got to make this offer. It's like emerging from us. And if this year has taught us anything, these lessons are perennial and we need not avoid teaching them because it was a tough year.
Absolutely. Let's go to a break and then come back and just talk about how you and I are already applying what we're learning working together in the book in the other projects we're working on together. So how we're kind of transferring some of that knowledge. And the book's not done quite yet. So maybe we can also share some of our plans of how we're going to get to the finish line. We'll be right back.
Why can't you behave? Oh, why can't you behave?
Welcome back. We've been spending some time talking today about just our lived reality that work and justice work and breakthrough work doesn't just happen in times that are clean, meaning unencumbered or uninterrupted or unscrewed around with, right? It's that we got to look for these openings. And we get to listen to the truth of what our bodies and our spirits and our minds are telling us as well, right? We're having these experiences. We are not automatons. We get to be whole people while we do hard work. So I'm curious, Alfonso, because you and I get to do a lot of projects together. Some are just thinking and planning projects. Some are budget and operations kind of decisions, but we have co-work that we need to do. And then we also have work where we sort of go to our separate corners and come back and tell each other about it. What do you think about what you've learned about working with me? And then I'll say what I've learned about just working with you is going to help you in future projects that we're doing together. What was it like about this kind of proximity during this kind of intensity that you feel like you're taking away into our future work?
So I'm thinking about two things are coming up for me. So one is I think I learned not to coast on the foundation or the history that we have. So really remembering we are alive now and we're not singular ways forever. So I think I learned a lot about a genuine, actual today check-in, like how are you really, but like really specifically, these are the three things in my awareness that I think might be impacting you, me, us, what we're trying to create together, and not deciding that because you were away or I was away during the last hard thing or flare up or moment, that it was going to be that was going to be sort of the answer, right? So I think just not coasting or taking it for granted. And then the other thing I think is we talk a lot about telling the truth. And I think both of us had to do a lot of like framing of how we were or what we were thinking, but then we would hear the other person respond and be like, oh, it's not that. Okay, here's the more truth. Okay, here's the all the way truth, right? And so I think something that we learned together or practiced together, I think a lot this year, was peeling back the layers and not just barreling through because there was a deadline or because we had told people, hey, we're writing a book.
Absolutely. I think some things that were new that I learned that I'm applying or that I want to apply is it's like I knew this if I really thought about it, but I didn't experience it in the same way until we were working on the book, is that environment really matters to you. And that could mean you want to be surrounded by a ton of Post-its, or you want to be in the sun, or you need the document printed. Whatever it is, like you get ready. And there's a way in which we had to get ready a bunch of different ways for different moments to move the project forward. And so I think one of the things I learned too is that we don't have to attach to the whole project feeling the same way or needing the same thing. And so we had to just stay creative and say, okay, if this isn't working, rather than try to like squeeze and push through, is there another way? Could we try it a different way? Should we use highlighters? Do you want to drive? Do we need different food, right? Food became important. So I think there's something about just remembering that we are adults trying to do hard things, and adults actually weren't designed to just sit in desk chairs and stare at screens. That's not the only way to work. And so I appreciated how creative you got. I've always known you're a walk-arounder when you think. You're a pacer, but the freedom with which you needed to move in order to write was like, get out of his way. There he goes. And I think that was just a reminder to have just sort of more freedom and flexibility. I would say the other thing I'm taking with me is I tried to stay conscious of, but I want to keep staying conscious of, things might be happening and they might be landing on you really different than me. Maybe it'll be easier. Maybe it'll be harder. Maybe it'll just be different. But I do think remembering to check in that just because something went over my head or didn't land inside my heart doesn't mean it didn't hit you. And so I think it's almost like checking for damage, right? It's like, oh, we were all in a rainstorm. Did you have hail damage? Like I was in the garage this time, right? And I don't mean to make it small like that, but a visual helps me remember that just because we were in the same storm doesn't mean, the same stuff happened to us. So I think just that practice of checking in reminds us again that we have a bigger menu we can choose from of next steps moving forward.
And I mean, it's so true because, we were in this cycle of editing and we'd get these letters back from our editor, Kelly. And I would just be furious. Like, I want to rip it up. And you're like, oh, it was so clear to me. I'm ready. And then there'd be other times where you'd be like, that was the meanest thing anyone has ever said to us. And I'm like, oh, all we have to do is like this and boop, boop, boop. And so it was,
Yeah, you're like
every other.
Yeah, you were like, we got the letter. I'm like, I know I'm laying down on the floor. I have a hot compress. I'm just trying not to cry. And you're like, okay, that's not how it landed on me. And I'm like, well, it's just true. And
Or I'd be like, I've closed my computer and I'm done for the day. Oh, geez, okay.
And neither one of us lobbied each other into trying to feel the same way. I didn't, neither of us had to do cheerleader, and neither of us were trying to drag the other person down. It was just like, well, both is true today.
And I think this isn't about like, hey, we're really good at being in a relationship. I think it took a lot of practice to say to on a regular basis, to be super vulnerable with someone you already feel connected to and care about. Like, I know we need another 1,000 words. They're not in there today. And part of why they're not in there today is like, I'm really fucking sad about how I'm seeing the COVID numbers affect Black and brown communities today. And so I can't be someone who's dreaming and creative right now, or, so I think it's like, it's a deepening or a new texture or a more complexity. And so I think that's really our offer of not just look at how great we are at doing this, but to acknowledge the rigor and the sort of consistency that it takes to be in a creative and creating, and to be in a work partnership that is about making creative offers that are forged, if you will, like in just this like very tumultuous year.
Well, I know you don't always love receiving compliments, but I want to close out today by just saying that I'm really grateful for you and our partnership, because I think part of what whiteness tries to trick us into doing is stay alone, right? There's an individualism streak in whiteness about who gets preferenced or who gets credit or who made the biggest impact. And I think I'm certain that what we're about to offer the world is better than what I could have offered alone. And I'm just really grateful that we get to remind our listeners that there is more work involved in relationships. Of course there is. And from an asset perspective, it just keeps being worth it.
Well, thank you. That feels really nice.
Will you tell our good people how to find us?
Yes. Well, first, if you're curious about this book, head to teamdynamicsmn.com/book, and you can sign up to get all of the previews and information. The goal is to get this book fully completed. The writing part is done. There's just some editing and zhuzhing and layout work to do. So teamdynamicsmn.com/book, and leave us your email. We also want to hear from you on Twitter @Behave Podcast, and tell us about how are you doing sort of creativity in partnership with folks who don't share your race and your gender. What are your practices? We always want to hear. Thanks so much for hanging out today. Wash your hands, wear a mask, and make good choices. I'm Alfonso Winker.
And I'm Trina Olson. And together, we're the co-founders of Team Dynamics.
And this is Behave.